IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, I'm Sarthak and I welcome you to All Things Policy. In this episode, we are going to discuss industrial policies. To be specific, we are going to discuss and analyze some of the most common arguments in favor of industrial policies. And we'll talk about some recent studies findings on the return of industrial policies. For this episode, I have with me my colleague Anupam. Hi Anupam, welcome to All Things Policy.
Hey Sarthak, glad to be here.
Yes, same here. A quick context before we start. What constitutes an industrial policy? It typically refers to government interventions that aim to transform the structure of economic activity. Usually there is some public goal as to why there is a need to bring about this transformation. For instance, it can be about creation of better jobs in the economy through a particular sector, or promoting exports, or ensuring regional developments, or promoting climate transition. And these are just some instances. There can be more. And the policy tools that are typically used to incentivize private sector in this direction, they are subsidies or import protection, exemption from regulation, public provision of inputs, to name a few. And there seems to be some economic rationale for all these things, and then there can be some geostrategic rationale for all these things. So in this episode, what we'll do is I'll just mention some of those arguments in favor of economic policies or industrial policies, economic rationale for industrial policies, and then we will see how strong are these arguments. Can there be some counter arguments to this? So let's start with some of these economic rationale for industrial policies. First, that is most commonly used is externalities. So industrial policies are there because they can address some externalities, or they can address some negative externalities, or they also can have some positive externalities. For instance, industrial policies can help avert those kind of situations where you're completely dependent on some other countries for goods, right? So there can be some national security externalities associated with industrial policy. So it will basically reduce dependence on foreign source of supplies. And another argument given is industrial policies can help create jobs. And when you create these jobs, if you have better jobs in the economy, it can lead to social cohesion, reduction in crime, reduction in drug addiction. So again, the person who is getting a job is benefited, but then there are third parties who also get benefited because society is now more cohesive. There is reduction. There is better law and order. There is reduction in crime. So Anupam, what do you have to say about this?
I disagree with everything that you just said,
Yeah.
as you could probably expect. But yeah, there's okay. Let's try and pick it apart one by one. To begin with, right? To begin with, the idea that you have dependence is not an externality. I mean, that's just a wrong definition of externality. If there is, I mean, there's all kinds of supply chain dependence, both in a geopolitical sense, even in a domestic sense. I can be dependent. I mean, I am, for example, dependent on you for let's say assessing assignments, right? But that's not an externality per se. It just means that that there is a particular supply and demand, and basically it's up to me to kind of as a firm strategize and then diversify my supply chain. So that's a very weak argument, in fact, for having this form of intervention. That's in a conceptual sense, but let's go into an even more kind of interesting idea that usually you get this argument that there's an analytical case for industrial policy based on the idea that there's a market failure that is kind of preventing industrialization, or having these negative externalities, etc. And so some form of government intervention, such as a subsidy, is necessary to correct that failure. The assumption here lies on the big assumption here is that there is, one relevant market failure, and that is the only distortion in the economy. And therefore, you can correct it by a targeted sort of subsidy or a targeted form of government intervention. But in the real world, right, the economy is full of distortions. It's not just distortion in whatever some form of externality that might exist, but there's a distortion in the labor market. There's a distortion in the entire regulatory environment. There's distortion in terms of concentration of market power. There's distortion in terms of how easy it is to get a permit, and how easy it is to run a business, and how easy it is to do a whole bunch of things, right? Now, the industrial policy is nothing but a scathing indictment of the existing environment of doing business, right? The industrial policy is nothing but a lazy excuse for not correcting the deep distortions in the economy. And so you're saying, okay, we can't do anything about all of those things. Why don't we just give subsidies in order to kind of compensate for all that is wrong with the economy, right? But in fact, it can make things worse. In many cases, it can make things worse, or at best, it is just completely ineffective, right? So you think about it. So sometimes you'll have this idea that, okay, let's promote competition in an industry, and in fact, what you might be doing is you might be giving subsidy to, let's say, a high polluter, right? And so you might increase competition, but you might make something else worse, because that's not how markets work. Right. Look at India's IT sector, for instance. Right now, India's IT sector is, it's a source of whatever India's comparative advantage, etc. But it's and now you're thinking of maybe, should we give targeted industrial policy for the IT sector and so on. But the fact is that this sector grew because your manufacturing sector was so constrained by labor regulations and poor infrastructure and so on, whereas the IT sector wasn't. Right, so it's an entirely different kind of excuse. Different kind of factor. Nothing to do with industrial policy per se. In fact, the idea that the IT sector was for so long ignored by the government was probably its biggest thing. So I think, one, you can't rely on this kind of simple causality saying, okay, there is one market failure, let's go correct it and wish away all of the other distortions in the economy. The reality is that there are multiple distortions, and you shouldn't look at industrial policy as an excuse for not correcting those deeper distortions. There's so much more I want to say about jobs, but I'll give you a chance to just kind of retort on this, and then I want to talk about jobs.
Yeah. So again, building on what you said, right, the example of IT industry, but here also what I think is, and again, some of Danny Rodriguez and others paper, they also talk about it. They say that private production again doesn't happen in isolation. There is, you need some sort of public inputs. For example, public goods are required. For example, you need to have law and order, stable law and order. You need to have appropriate regulation, infrastructure, education. All these things are required. And even if you look at IT sector, right, again, it has, I don't think, come up everywhere. It has come up in some places, like for example, in Bangalore or in Hyderabad, where maybe you have all these things in place, and maybe it has not come up in some other places where we did not have these kind of basic setup in place. So some public goods might be required, and that is what that can form a part of industrial policy.
No, but that actually, if anything, this furthers and cements my argument, right? That you don't need to give subsidies for targeted sectors or give subsidies for certain firms and say, why don't you produce? Instead, what you need to do is replicate the success factors, which is, as you said, good infrastructure, good education, good, basic sense of public goods, etc. And I don't think any economist will ask the government not to provide public goods, or not to invest in some way or the other, in education. But that's not industrial policy. Education is different from industrial policy, right? And I don't think that's the argument here at all. I'm all for investing more in education. Of course, there's better and worse ways of doing it. I'm not saying the government should run schools, but that's an entirely different argument. But investing in education, infrastructure, health. These are things with positive externalities, and then of course public goods or some form of this. I think why not? I mean, yeah, sure, go for it. But that's not industrial policy. The industrial policy, in the way that it is playing out today, is you're giving targeted subsidies to certain firms and saying, I want you to produce more of this. Right? Look at, I mean, I can give you the statistics. I mean, there are 14 sectors, for example, in India, which is chosen for industrial policy. These are, for I don't know on what basis they were chosen, but these are the sectors, from IT hardware to pharmaceutical drugs, medical devices, food processing, telecom and networks, solar PV modules, advanced chemistry, automobiles and auto components, textiles, specialty sectors, semiconductors, and two sets of things that I don't know what it is. So that's why I put it last, but something called LSEM and KSM DI API. I mean, these are just abbreviations. I probably should have done my homework, but the idea is fairly simple, that, you just pick 14 sectors, and these are randomly chosen sectors which the government thinks we should be doing more of. It's not even based on some things like, reveal comparative advantage or anything of that sort. For whatever reason you've chosen here, and there's a budgetary outlay, right? It's not meant for the fundamental things that you spoke about, which is infrastructure, education, and
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for this. So basically, the definition of industrial policy again has to be very precise, right? It should not include all these other kind of public goods. It should only be a subset of that, maybe.
Yeah, no, I'm saying you do public goods as you're supposed to be doing. I mean, the government, one of the big role of the government in markets is provision of public goods, which the market cannot, right? So I have no problem with that, but that is not industrial policy, right? That is not industrial policy at all. That's its primary duty. Industrial policy, the way it's acting out is, as I said, giving targeted subsidies to certain firms to basically, I mean, what you're saying is we're going to reduce your cost, right? And we're going to give you an incentive to set things up. That's all you're doing.
So again, this related to this targeted intervention. Now, another argument that is there is there can sometimes be coordination failures in the economy. So basically, profitability in a sector might require scaling up of related economic activities, and maybe without a push from the government, this coordination failure will not be addressed, and you might end up in suboptimal circumstances. So industrial policies can help achieve a more optimal equilibrium, maybe.
Yeah, I'm again very doubtful of that, because the firms in the world and in different countries have done a fantastic job over time without the need for government government involvement, right? I mean, look at, for example, one of my favorite examples is the automobile sector. Right now, while the government put all of its bets on Maruti Udyog and trying to increase that, and then had its own automobile policy, and then gave a big push towards it, etc. Now, you didn't have any government intervention which said, let's do auto parts until now. I mean, now it's part of the PLI, but for the longest time, auto parts was actually just ignored. But you had a thriving automobile parts industry in India growing, and in fact, even exporting to the rest of the world, because, well, people saw that there was a need for it. The environment was ripe for it. And again, and people said this is a profit opportunity. And so therefore they started, producing that. So again, coordination failure, I think, occurs when the markets are deeply distorted. Right now, it feels like I'm just stuck record, but when you have deep distortions in the economy where a business cannot just be started even when they see a profit motive, etc., then you have, coordination failures, because even though some people see a clear opportunity for profit, they're not able to just go and take advantage of it. And now, instead of actually clearing out those structural failures, what you're saying is, okay, we'll add another layer of distortions and give you subsidy on top of it, right? Now, the problem is, of course, this is still picking winners. As in, today, the problem could be that there's coordination failure in the pharmaceutical industry, and therefore you'll give a bunch of subsidies in one place. But tomorrow, that same thing will play out in 10 other industries, right? Or it's simultaneously already playing out. And so you're not fixing the structural issues, but you're giving out random incentives. Now, this is also deeply distortive. So now you might have, as I said, you take another example, you might have randomly, right? You might have set of firms who see an opportunity in one sector, right? Maybe, as I said, in the automobile, whatever, tire industry, and they would have invested in that because there's a huge demand, etc. But now there's no incentives there, but you have a bunch of incentives in the some allied sector in pharmaceuticals, and so you're going to distort the capital, right? And lots of people are going to take this up, and you're going to have deeper kind of distortions in the other sector. So I think that's what I'm deeply uncomfortable with, the fact that we can trust some set of officials sitting in a government department to actually figure out what is required for the economy. And come on, I think this is hubris, this is overconfidence, this is just arrogance to be able to imagine that you can design this. I mean, I call upon the ghosts of von Mises and Friedrich Hayek in this thing, in terms of it's just that, because Hayek said this, right, about how economists, how people think they can design things, but they absolutely fail at it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there will be information shortcomings, right? I mean, you don't know how much. If you are at you're a central authority and you are trying to figure out how much demand will be there and how much supply should be there. I mean, one body or one individual, one institution might not be able to estimate all these things. So there will always be these information shortcomings.
Exactly.
And then there is also a possibility of, yeah, go ahead.
No, I want to read out Hayek's quote, right? It didn't come to me in the moment, but it is one of my favorite quotes, which is, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design." And for me, if there is one quote that is fitting about industrial policy, it's this.
Yeah, interesting. And not only this, right? There is also a possibility of political capture. There might be self-interested lobbying groups. There might be, they will try to ensure that they get more of government resources, or they get more of these benefits, rather than, their focus will not necessarily be on increasing societal benefits.
Absolutely. So, as I said, as I think I just began to allude to it in the previous conversation, right? You're going to be replacing, in many cases, one type of distortions with another, right? So you'll give subsidies, but that, as I said, it's not sector wide. It's not even sometimes large scale fixing the structural transformation kind of subsidies, right? It's very specific to certain firms. What this will do is it will increase the concentration of corporate power, right? And you will have entrenched companies in place who will then do everything they can to exploit the system so that they keep getting that thing. So a couple of things will happen, right? Once you get a subsidy, these firms will first ensure that they're the only ones who are getting the subsidy and not their competitors. Obviously, they'll try to, as always, right? You make a hole big enough for you to go through and then close the hole immediately behind you, right? So that nobody else can enter. And then you're going to also, they will use their power. We're truly concerned about, I think, concentration of corporate power, because this will entrench companies in place, and once they're entrenched, they will exploit the system. They'll do two things, right? One, they will make sure that other companies don't get the subsidy. So it's basically they create a hole, they go through, and then they close the hole behind them, right? So which means that they're the only ones who are enjoying this set of privileges. Second bit, remember that the conditions that led to them getting subsidies is that you have a bunch of structural problems. It means that it is not possible for any company to kind of grow out of that, and therefore you're getting a subsidy, right? So now they will make sure that those structural problems are not corrected, right? Because once it's corrected, then you can have competition. So they will also make sure that you don't correct those structural flaws. So I think this is a deeply problematic aspect, right? So this will lead to barriers to competition. This will lead to barriers to entry. They get political say. They get even cozier with the political system. There'll be rent seeking. Basically, this is what political capture is, right? They'll manipulate the entire systems to keep themselves in the privileged position. So that's not something that you want. I can give hundreds of examples where this happened. I mean, the entire 60s to 90s in India was exactly this: political capture to get whatever little bit of benefit from industrial policy. I mean, there sometimes it was subsidy, sometimes it was just getting a nod, right? Of getting a yes to
Maybe a license or something. Yeah.
license and so on, but that it all is in the same kind of this thing. And this has happened in the US. This is happening right now in the US with their set of subsidies. So I think this is fairly well established.
Yeah. So, Anupam, yeah, before we go to move US, let's take a quick break. In fact, till now we have been talking about things in India, how things have panned out. But let's look at the larger global scenario after the break.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Hi, welcome from the break. So we have been talking about IPs in India. Now let's look at how IPs are being used world over, and we'll look at some interesting statistics. And this is again from a recent paper. We will share the link of the paper along with this podcast. Now, industry policy has become very common and it is on the rise. The number of industrial policies has gone up in the last 10 years or so, and the share of industrial policies in the total policies has also gone up. For instance, the number of industrial policies was around 380, 400 in 2009. It has become somewhere around 1150 by 2018. The share of industrial policies in total policies world over has also increased from 18% to 46% in the same time period. So world over, the industrial policies have become more common. So the question is, if everyone is going ahead with industrial policies, then what should be the policy option for India? Now, I just want to add 2-3 more points to this. Now, we might assume that industrial policies are used by countries which are maybe not as developed, which are which do not have very high GDP per capita, the low income countries or the middle income countries. But if you look at the numbers, the richer countries, they are using more industrial policies. For instance, Germany has the maximum number of industrial policies. And again, if you look at the sectors in which the industrial policies are used, there is also something which is interesting. Countries which already have a comparative advantage, they were already exporting more of more goods in a particular sector, right? In those sectors, they are using industrial policies more often. So the rich countries, they more often use industrial policies. They're using industrial policies in those sectors where they already have a comparative advantage, and the share of industrial policies has gone up. So what do you have to say for this, right? Because again, the assumption is in developed economies, you will have well-functioning markets, the institutions will be better. So maybe you don't need industrial policies. But why are they doing it? And if they are doing it, what option does a country like India have?
Right. So, this is, I think, it's an unfortunate kind of turn of events in the world. But let's look at it in, try to place all of this in context. I think the beginning of all of this is the 2008 financial crisis. This turn of events, right? Now, we went from a golden period of economic growth, free trade, open borders, movement of labor and capital and so on until 2008. To, of course, a financial crisis in the US, which spread the world over. And then you had the European, debt crisis, which is forever lingering on. Japan, of course, has had very low kind of both industrial output and otherwise economic growth. And so on. So you're seeing kind of a depressed economic scenario in the world over. And, at that point of time, there's also a rise of authoritarianism and the birth of right-wing politics. A whole bunch of those things, right? Now, it's in that context that you have to put industrial policy, because right at the beginning, you kind of understood that, okay, governments are now going to play a far bigger role in markets, right? The 2008, I mean, there was the US had what, 1 trillion, $2 trillion worth of subsidies, and the basically the recovery plan. China had some 800 billion worth, etc. I mean, I don't know the numbers. It seems like a very long time back, but basically the world over there was a massive government spending in order to come out of the your 2008 financial crisis, and that kind of continued in one way or the other, right? Even the Eurozone crisis, it kind of continued all the way up till 2000, and then you had Trump, and who started a trade war. So you put that in context as well, right? Because this is the similar time when countries all over the world also started growing more protectionist, because industrial policy, like it or not, goes hand in hand with protectionism. Because and in fact, if you ask me about the single biggest evidence for why industrial policy has not worked, it's the fact that you also need protectionism at the same time, right? Because I mean, think about it, it's just logical, right? If you are saying that I'm going to give subsidies, etc., for my domestic industry to grow, and at the same time you're saying I'm not confident enough that this will work, that they can compete with the world, so what I will also do is protect them from foreign competition. And those, I mean, it's like double speak, right? Back in Orwellian terms, it's double think, right? On one hand, you're saying I have the greatest policy to help my industry. On the other hand, I'm saying I also need something to protect them. So it makes no sense in my head, and it's already a damning kind of admittance or admission that industrial policy doesn't work. So anyway. So that's the context, right? That's the context. And so you have countries becoming more protectionist. You have countries closing down their borders. You have countries becoming stricter about labor movements. You have countries, and then finally it's about industrial this thing. And remember also, I mean, industrial subsidy is one big form of a trade distortion, right? Apart from other things, subsidies is an equal form of trade distortion as a tariff. And now you're putting both. So that tells you that it's not so much about your whatever green transition and all the other externalities and that rot set of excuses that was given earlier, but what it means is basically we are looking inward. America first in the US, and make in India and whatever in each country, right? Basically, you're saying that I want my companies to grow because it's politically that's the best thing I can do right now. I can't deliver growth, so what I will deliver is cheap populism, which means part of it is this industrial policy, right? And that's what your entire set of industrial policies is, according to me. Now, is there some success? Yeah, I mean, any time when you're going to spend that much amount of money, there will be some success stories, right? But if you look at the overall picture, I don't think it's successful. Just the fact that so many countries are pursuing industrial policy doesn't mean it's a success, right? I mean, in the height of World War II, so many countries spent a lot of money on arms, this thing, and in Cold War it was an arms race. That doesn't mean that was a good thing for the world, right? You had, I mean, in the East Asian crisis, just after that, there was a beggar thy neighbor policy, right? The entire world was looked at as a zero-sum game, where there's competitive devaluation, for example, right? That doesn't mean it was good. So just the idea that many countries are doing it doesn't mean that it's a good thing, okay? There's lots of idiotic policies that many countries are doing, and that's not a justification at all, right? So now we're entering unfortunately in that same framing of the problem in zero-sum terms, right? That I win at the expense of you and you win at the expense of me, and therefore we both should erect barriers. But what happens is that you're going to spend a lot of money just to be in the same place, right? You will do industrial policy and then you will do protectionism, and you will actually go no further than what you were, and that's the result that we're going to see. So I think I'm again very skeptical of that. And it's a very weak argument to say Germany does it, so we should do it as well. So now comes back to that point, right? What if everybody is doing it? What should India do? And this is where I'll sound like an extremist, but I'm happy to wear that hat. I still believe in unilateral reduction in trade barriers. And I think that is the best thing for India. I still believe that having no industrial policy is good for India. I mean, no industrial policy in the way that we're seeing it today, but I'm all for, as I said, fixing structural issues that will make truly the job of creating industries easier.
So this is something which is kind of different, completely different, right? Polar opposite of PLIs, right? That we are using for like what 14, 15 sectors now.
Yeah, we're using PLI for 14 sectors at least, with some 3 trillion rupees budgetary outlay, or I don't know if it is more now, but there and thereabouts. So, since you mentioned PLIs, right, let me take a dig at that as well. I mean, why not? Since I probably said so many things that will have people throw stones at me. Let me add one more to the list, which is PLI, right? Now, one of the things, and I said I'd come back to this, right, about jobs. So you said, industrial policy is also a way to create jobs, etc. But look at the PLI. Now, it is clear, for example, to begin with, that India requires lots and lots of job creation. And I think we have done so many podcast episodes about it that I don't want to touch upon it here. But we need, obviously, jobs, right? But most of the subsidies to manufacturing is for highly capital intensive industries like, semiconductors and for R&D in pharma and so on. And it has actually got nothing to do with job creation. Right? It doesn't go to labor intensive sectors at all. Right? There's one which is on textiles, etc. But if you look at most of it, as I said, IT hardware, pharmaceutical drugs, manufacturing medical devices, high efficiency solar modules, etc. All of these are capital intensive. They're not labor intensive. So you're actually going against your so-called comparative advantage. Right? And now why is this? Because the government at some point thinks that, okay, we should be in on these sectors. This is good and therefore we should do it. Does the market bear it out? Is there, proof for all of this? I don't think so. It's just randomly selected set of industries, right? And then you also have this idea that, that there's so much, the viability for such highly capital intensive kind of activity in India is quite low. And therefore you only have a small set of industries which will end up getting this PLI, which will further, as I said, increase that concentration of market power. Because even to receive that subsidy and make use of it and meeting the targets, etc., right? It's only a few firms can do it. So you're not actually giving, large scale subsidy to even small and medium scale enterprises, etc., etc. But you're obviously going to give it in the hands of a very few set of companies, right? That is one. The second bit, I will go on, Sarthak, until you stop me, because I can talk about this for hours. But the second big thing is, of course, if you just look at the pattern, most of PLI, that budgetary usage is for recurring payments, which means that current receivers of PLI will ask for more SOPs. Because this then becomes kind of a sunk cost fallacy, right? Some government says, oh, we've done PLI, we've given to this much, and now the results don't come through. And they say because it's not enough, right? Now, both will look bad. So on one hand, the industry will say, you give us more and therefore we can do. And the government looks bad. They can't say, oh, we gave this much money, but it's a failure. So they will pour in even more money, right? And it becomes a massive sunk cost fallacy. And I think that's a complete waste on public expenditure. And if you look at you're all this Make in India and PLI schemes, if you look at, just contribution of manufacturing in GDP, it's actually gone down in the last 5 years. Right? From 2014-15, the share of manufacturing was 16.3% of part of GDP. In 2019-20, it went down to 15.1%. So, that's again hard statistics, but leave that aside just for now, okay? Because, we can go on and on. The other part is, there's huge amount of compliance costs. Now, this is maybe they've learned from earlier, or maybe they've learned from other countries, whatever, but they've tried to put in very strict set of conditions as to who gets PLI. One of the problems of this is that there's huge compliance costs, right? It becomes a purely bureaucratic approach. So I'll give you one example. The big document for the auto sector, for any firms in the auto sector who wants to get subsidy as part of PLI, is 187 pages long. Okay, so you can just imagine the kind of compliance cost, right? And then in the electronic sector, for example, the PLI scheme for electronic sector has very specific eligibility criteria, right? Which means which is that they have to have both incremental investment and incremental sales that a company needs to commit over the next 5 years. Now, how do you commit incremental sales? This is not in your hands, by the way, right? And so now you're getting a PLI and you have to commit to incremental sales, and and then that's not a part of it, right? And then basically you'll say, okay, we'll protect all of this, but you have to start manufacturing the things that you currently import, etc. And and this will be verified and cross-checked by a project management agency or a government body, basically, which has a whole bunch of different set of committees. I mean, if I actually tell you how that PMA, how this works, right, you'll lose your mind. So let me give you a sample. For example, the PMA, or the project management agency, will submit its recommendation to something called an empowered committee. This empowered committee has the CEO of Niti Aayog. It has the Secretary of Economic Affairs, Secretary of Expenditure, Secretary of MeitY, Secretary of Revenue, Secretary of DPIIT, which is Industrial Promotion. It has the DGFT and so on, right? And now all of these guys will make the final decision. The empowered committee can also revise anything. They can suddenly revise subsidy rate. They can revise eligibility criteria. They can revise target segment, etc. The reason I spoke so much is I'm just trying to give you a picture of what we're trying to enter into, right? We're entering into a highly bureaucratic red tape. I like the phrase that I used in one of my op-eds. This is nothing but a rich tapestry of red tape. That's all this is going to create, right? And finally, I will stop here, Sarthak, as I promised. Finally, if you look again the statistics of where PLI was used, right? A majority of PLI subsidy is used for paying the import tariffs. So basically, it's the right hand of the government giving money to the left hand of the government. Or whichever way you please, right? Because now what you've done is you put massive amounts of tariffs on imports because you're saying, okay, we want, let's say, electronic industry. You put tariffs on chips, you put tariffs on, all kinds of components. And then you're saying we'll give PLI for laptop manufacturing. Firstly, by the way, nobody took that up, and which is why you had this entire saga and drama about laptop import licensing and so on. But leave that aside for the moment. You put massive amounts of tariffs. You can't import things freely, and then you're giving PLI, right? So somebody will take that subsidy and pay the import tariffs and basically import things, and then they will assemble and say, that's in which universe does that look like success? And in which universe does it tell you that we should be doing more of this?
Exactly. So just last one point, Danny Roderick's paper talks about something which might sound like a misnomer. He's recommending that we should have possibly industrial policy for the services sector. And now you also mentioned that the share of manufacturing has gone down. So does it
No. No. I mean, at least in industrial policy, some babu can go and count the number of output items, right? In the service sector, you can't even do that, and you're going to be stuck with an even more bizarre set of rules as to who qualifies, who doesn't, how much does each. It's a nightmare waiting to happen. So please don't even utter those words allowed, because the one thing that is apparently working in India is the service sector. You don't want to kill that with some idiotic form of industrial policy.
So I think this is the right point to conclude, right point to conclude this episode. Anupam, do you want to add anything?
No, I'm enough. Don't do industrial policy.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Anupam, for joining me in this episode. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. We'll meet again in one more episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.